The buzzards were circling low that morning. Elias Callahan squinted against the brutal Texas sun as he drove the final nail into a warped fence post. The heat shimmered off the dry earth, and the only sounds were the groan of old wood and the steady creak of the saddle leather hanging on the porch behind him. Not even the wind dared to stir under that heavy sky. The land was holding its breath, and so was he. He didn't know why. Just that old soldier's feeling crawling up the back of his neck, the same one that once warned him of an ambush outside Vicksburg, and again when cholera swept through his wife and boy before the doctor could arrive. It wasn't superstition, it was instinct. And it was how he'd stayed alive long enough to lose everything else. Scout, his old cattle dog, whined low in his throat. Elias stood, brushed dirt from his knees, and followed the dog's gaze to the horizon. For a moment, there was nothing but the heat waves dancing in the distance. Then a flicker, movement, small, stumbling, human. His heart dropped. No one came this far out unless they were desperate or dangerous, sometimes both. He grabbed his canteen and moved down the slope toward the creek, boots crunching dry grass. The figure came into view, closer now, a child, a girl, maybe 8 or 9. Her skin dark, sunburned, her hair braided with feathers, now tangled with dust. Clothes torn, faded, barely hanging on her bony frame. She didn't walk so much as sway forward in jerky steps, like a newborn calf with legs that didn't quite belong to her yet. A Comanche child, and she was dying on his land. Elias froze. Every bone in his body told him this was a kind of danger no rifle could stop. Folks around Amarillo didn't call Comanche raids incidents anymore. They called them warnings, the kind that left barns burned to the ground and families buried in shallow graves. And yet here stood one of their own, collapsing feet from his creek, too far gone to even be afraid. Scout whimpered beside him. The smart thing, the survival thing, was to turn around, leave her, let nature do what the Comanche might do later. But the soldier in him, the father, the man, couldn't walk away from that face. Those hollow cheeks, that look of silent, exhausted pleading. Elias took slow steps toward her, hands out where she could see them. "Hey," he said gently. "You hear me, little one?" The girl's knees buckled. He caught her before she hit the dirt, her body light as a sack of feed. Her skin was hot, lips cracked, eyes half closed. She tried to speak, but all that came out was a rasp and a dry click in her throat. He didn't need to understand the words. She was starving. He hoisted her into his arms, heart pounding now, not from fear of her, but of what she represented. A Comanche girl this deep into settler territory. Something had gone terribly wrong. He carried her back to the cabin. Inside, the cool dimness was a mercy. He laid her gently in the one real chair he owned, then lit the stove and ladled out a bowl of leftover rabbit stew. Scout sat watching the girl, ears twitching with tension. Elias dipped a corner of bread into the broth and brought it to the girl's lips. She flinched at first, then took a bite, another. Then she devoured the bread like it might vanish if she hesitated. With each mouthful, colour returned faintly to her cheeks. Elias offered her water, which she drank so fast he had to pull it away before she choked. He crouched beside her, watching her breathe, small and uneven. That's when he saw it. Around her neck, half buried in her tattered dress, hung a necklace, beads strung with meticulous care, shaped like a hawk's feather, woven in a red and black diamond pattern. He had seen that pattern before. Walter Hensley, his old neighbour, had described it just last week. "Ain't many of 'em wearing that. Chief Red Eagle's kin. Only his blood carries the hawk feather beadwork." Elias stared at the necklace. His breath caught. The girl wasn't just Comanche. She was the Comanche's, Red Eagle's only daughter. And Elias Callahan had just brought her into his home. His mind raced. If anyone saw her here, if word got out, he'd be labeled a kidnapper, a provocateur, or worse. No jury, no trial, just a burned ranch and a pine box. He looked back at the girl. Her eyes fluttered open, then locked on his. She reached out with one trembling hand and touched the rim of the bowl again. She didn't know what he was thinking, didn't care who he was. All she saw was a man with food, warmth, and water. Elias stood, gritted his teeth, and went to the shelf. He pulled down his old cavalry pistol and loaded all 6 chambers. Then he sat back down. "You picked one hell of a place to fall, little bird," he murmured. Outside, the prairie had gone too quiet. Scout growled. Elias moved to the window. Something was out there. He felt it more than saw it, a shadow on the ridge, a flicker of movement. Then, faintly, the low, steady pulse of a drum, and another, and another. War drums. Not close, not yet, but getting closer. He turned back to the girl, still curled in the chair, the beaded necklace glinting in the firelight. He hadn't just helped a starving child. He'd ignited the fuse on something far bigger than himself. And whatever was coming across those hills, it wasn't coming in peace. The morning came heavy and grey, casting long, cool shadows across Elias Callahan's porch. A rare cloud cover veiled the ruthless Texas sun, but the reprieve brought no peace. Elias hadn't slept. He'd sat all night in a crooked kitchen chair, staring through the window with his rifle across his lap, listening for hoofbeats. The girl, Little Dove, he was sure now, still slept in the worn chair by the fire, her breath shallow but steady, her small hands curled around the hem of the quilt. Scout dozed by the door, tail twitching every few minutes, as if even in sleep, the old dog sensed what Elias did. Something was coming. He heard them before he saw them. 3 horses, riding hard. He stepped out onto the porch as a cloud of dust rose over the southern trail. Scout snapped upright, barking once before Elias hushed him with a hand. A moment later, the riders came into view. Bo McAllister was in the lead, shirt soaked through with sweat despite the early hour. His eyes locked onto Elias like a loaded gun. Behind him rode Deputy Sam Whitaker, and last, Reverend Alden Pike, his long black coat flapping like a funeral flag. They didn't dismount. Bo shouted before his horse had even come to a full stop. "Are you out of your damn mind, Callahan?" Elias raised a hand, calm and slow. "You might want to lower your voice." "There's smoke signals in the ridge," Bo snapped. "And tracks. Fresh ones. Comanche, lots of 'em. Deputy says they're heading this way." Deputy Whitaker nodded. He was younger than Elias remembered, all narrow shoulders and watchful eyes. "My pa sent word from town. Word is Chief Red Eagle's daughter went missing during a hunting party 3 days ago. Disappeared in that storm that rolled through." Bo kicked at the porch post with his boot. "That's why we're here. You seen anything?" Elias didn't speak. He just turned and opened the cabin door wide enough for them to see inside. There was a beat of silence. Then the preacher crossed himself. "Sweet Lord," Reverend Pike whispered. "It's her." Little Dove was still asleep, tangled in the blanket, her cheek resting against the back of the chair. Her face looked softer now, less hollow, though the necklace still glinted on her chest like a brand of fire. Bo spat into the dirt. "You damn fool!" "I couldn't let her die," Elias said quietly. "You should have," Bo snapped. "You know what this looks like? You taken her in. What you think they'll assume?" "I didn't kidnap her." "You think they care what you did or didn't do? You're a white man. She's a chief's daughter. They see it. They don't ask questions. They take what they want, and they burn the rest." Deputy Whitaker dismounted and stepped closer. "Look, Elias, I believe you. I do. But this ain't just between you and her anymore. Word gets out. It's going to set the whole territory on fire. You need to get her back. Now. Before they find you here." Elias folded his arms. "She can't ride. She's weak, fevered. I can't just throw her on a horse and send her off." "Then you ride with her," Bo barked. "You take her to their camp, beg forgiveness, I don't care, but if they get here first—" He jabbed a finger at the hills. "It'll be too late." "I don't know where their camp is," Elias said flatly. "I do," Deputy Whitaker replied. "I've seen scouts moving northeast toward Dry Rock Canyon. It's Comanche land." "That's a death ride," Elias muttered. "They see me coming. They'll shoot first." "Then don't let 'em see you coming," Bo said. "Hell, you're good at sneaking up on people, aren't you, soldier?" Elias didn't respond to the jab. He just stared out across the prairie. The sun was rising now, faint shafts of light pushing through the clouds, illuminating the wild, broken beauty of the land. He'd seen a lot of death, too much, but none of it had felt this heavy. Not even when he buried his wife and son. This was different. This wasn't about war. It was about doing something good, maybe for the first time in years, and it might still cost him everything. Bo swung back onto his saddle. "You've got a few hours, maybe. But when those warriors get here, it ain't just your scalp they'll be after. They'll ride straight through town, through my place." "My kid's place." Whitaker grabbed the reins of his horse. "I'm riding back to warn the others. Elias, don't wait too long. You're already sitting in a coffin." Reverend Pike nodded once. "You did right by the Lord," he said. "But now you need to make peace with man." The three men turned their horses and galloped south, a fresh cloud of dust rising behind them. Elias stood in silence, listening until their hoofbeats faded. Scout whined beside him. He stepped back inside the cabin. Little Dove was awake now, her eyes following him, heavy with confusion. She didn't speak, but her hand crept toward the stew pot on the stove. "You can eat," Elias said, sitting beside her. "But we've got trouble coming. I don't think you understand just how bad." She looked at him, head tilted slightly. Then she pointed at herself, then toward the door, then at Elias. He didn't follow. She pointed again. This time she tapped her chest and opened and closed her fingers 10 times, over and over. But Elias frowned. He watched closely. 10, 20, 30. She stopped at 200. He went cold. "You saw them?" She nodded. Slowly, gravely. Scout growled, ears perked. Elias stood, heart pounding. He grabbed the old cavalry satchel off the hook, stuffed in dried meat, water, his sidearm. Then he looked at the girl. "Can you ride?" She didn't understand. He mimed the reins. "Horse," he said. "Can you stay up?" She nodded, not confidently, but enough. "Then we ride." He threw the blanket around her, lifted her gently, and stepped out to the barn. The wind was shifting, kicking up dust from the west. Storm or riders, he couldn't tell. Elias saddled his mare, helped Little Dove into the saddle ahead of him, and looked out toward the ridgeline. The sun was climbing now, painting the hills in blood-orange light, and just for a moment, high on the crest, he thought he saw a lone figure watching, still as stone, painted in war colors. They weren't waiting for nightfall. They were coming now, and there was no way out but through. The canyon path was narrow and dry, winding between rust-colored cliffs that rose like broken teeth on either side. Elias rode low in the saddle, one hand holding the reins, the other steadying the girl in front of him. Little Dove was wrapped in a wool blanket, her head against his chest, her body limp with fever and fatigue. She hadn't spoken since they left the ranch. Scout trotted beside them, alert, ears twitching with every rock slide and bird call. The air was thick with dust and tension. Elias had taken the back route through Brush Hollow, terrain only trappers and outlaws dared pass. It was slow going, but it was the only way that might avoid a head-on encounter. He didn't know how far they were from the Comanche camp, but he knew time was working against him. The drumming had stopped. That worried him more than the sound itself. He scanned the ridgelines constantly. Too many blind corners, too many places for a man to catch an arrow in the ribs before he ever saw the bowstring pulled. Little Dove stirred. Her hand reached for the saddle horn, gripping it weakly. She turned her face toward him and whispered something he didn't understand, voice dry and cracked like leaves in autumn. But her eyes, they weren't fearful anymore, just tired, trusting. That was worse somehow. They crested a rise, and Elias pulled the horse to a stop. The view below stretched out like a painting. Rolling hills dotted with scrub brush, a shallow creek cutting through the middle, and in the distance, movement. He squinted. Riders. Dozens of them, maybe more, all moving in formation. The sun glinted off spears and feathers, the distinct flow of war paint visible even from this far. Elias sucked in a breath through his teeth. "We're too late." They were already in motion, heading straight for his ranch. He turned the horse around, pulling gently. "We have to go back," he muttered. "We're not going to make it there before they make it to us." But he knew what that meant. Going back didn't buy them time. It placed them in the direct path of what was coming. There'd be no talking once the warriors reached the property, no reasoning, just judgment. Little Dove tapped his arm. She pointed east, off the path. He followed her finger. There was nothing there but brush and jagged rock. "What is it?" he asked. She gestured again, more urgently this time. Then she made a motion, circling her hand above her head, then tapping her chest, and finally pointing into the distance. Elias watched her, trying to make sense of the signs. It clicked. A signal. A marker. She recognized the land. "You know a way," he said. She nodded. He looked at the narrowing sun, then the terrain. Whatever chance they had, it was through her. "All right," he said. "Lead the way." He turned the horse east. They rode hard, winding through shallow gullies and dry washes, the terrain uneven and wild. At one point, Scout darted ahead, barking once. Elias pulled up short. A small rise gave way to a sloping meadow that descended toward a rocky outcrop. From this angle, he could see them, not just a few, but hundreds. Comanche warriors, their horses standing still, stretched in a massive semicircle around his ranch. From the distance, his barn looked small, fragile. He hadn't realized how exposed it really was. Elias's throat tightened. They were already there, but they weren't moving. He handed the reins to Little Dove and slipped down from the saddle, watching the scene unfold below. The warriors held formation, weapons ready, but lowered. At the front of the group sat a man on a massive chestnut horse, taller, broader than the others. His face was painted with streaks of red and black, and his long hair was bound in silver-threaded braids. Chief Red Eagle. Elias had never seen him in person, but there was no mistaking the posture, the stillness that radiated power. The men flanking him sat like statues, but even from here, Elias could feel the air pulsing with tension. They weren't attacking. Not yet. He turned to Little Dove, who had also climbed down. She stared at the sight, her expression unreadable. "What do we do now?" Elias asked quietly. She didn't answer with words. She stepped forward, straightened her back, and lifted her chin. Then she started walking, slowly but surely, toward the slope that would take them into the circle below. Elias moved to stop her, but Scout barked once, sharply, and then followed her. He stood frozen. Every instinct screamed to stay back, to run the other way. But what choice did he have? He grabbed the reins and followed her down the hill. The ride into the circle was silent, the only sound the slow, rhythmic clop of the horses' hooves on dry dirt. As they approached, warriors began to shift. Arrows were drawn, spears lowered. Elias raised his hands high, palms open. Little Dove rode just ahead of him, back straight, eyes forward. As they entered the circle, the warriors began to part, just enough for them to pass through. Chief Red Eagle remained still. Elias brought the horse to a stop a dozen yards away. Then he climbed down, pulled Little Dove from the saddle, and set her gently on her feet. She clutched the edge of her blanket, but didn't hide. She took a step forward. One of the warriors let out a sharp whistle. It echoed like a gunshot. Red Eagle dismounted. The silence was complete. He strode toward them, his steps slow but deliberate, eyes burning with a fury that had no temperature, only weight. When he stood before Elias, the chief spoke. "You took my daughter." His voice was heavy, accented, but the words were clear. Elias didn't flinch. "She came to me, alone, dying. You fed her." "I did." "You gave her shelter." "Yes." "Why?" Elias's throat tightened. He could feel the eyes of 100 men on him. "Because she was a child. Because I lost one of my own, and I couldn't lose another." Red Eagle looked down at Little Dove, who stood silently beside Elias. He reached out, brushed her cheek, then touched the necklace at her chest. His hand trembled just for a second. Then his gaze turned back to Elias. "She carries the blood of warriors. She is my only child. I know. You could have taken her, ransomed her, killed her. I didn't. Why should I believe you?" Elias reached into his coat and pulled out a torn scrap of fabric, the one he'd found on the fence, caught when she'd passed through. He handed it forward. "She was already bleeding when I found her." Red Eagle took it. Little Dove stepped closer to her father and began speaking rapidly in Comanche. Her voice was hoarse but full. She pointed to Elias, then to the sky, then made motions of eating, sleeping, and resting. Her story spilled out in fragments: desperation, kindness, warmth, food. Red Eagle didn't interrupt. When she was done, he looked at Elias again. "You will come with us," he said. Elias tensed. "Where?" "To the council. The elders will decide if your mercy was a trick or a truth." Elias looked at the sea of warriors, at their weapons, at the sharpened eyes trained on him like knives, and then he looked at the girl. "I'll go," he said, and the circle began to close. The ride to the Comanche camp was long and silent, save for the steady rhythm of hooves and the occasional whinny of a horse. Elias rode in the center of the formation, flanked by warriors on all sides. His hands were unbound, but the message was clear. He wasn't a guest. He was being escorted to something between a trial and a reckoning. Little Dove rode beside him, mounted on a paint mare with a blanket draped over her shoulders. Her face was calm, but her eyes flicked toward him often. Scout trotted behind, tail low, ears high. The dog hadn't left Elias's side once. The land around them grew wilder as they left the familiar edge of settler territory. Red rock canyons rose in layers, and cottonwood trees lined the dry creek beds. They crossed narrow passes and wound through switchbacks Elias had never seen before, though he'd lived in this country for over a decade. The Comanche knew this land like breath. They vanished and reappeared through it like shadows. When the camp came into view, it struck Elias like a vision. Dozens of lodges arranged in a circle, smoke rising in graceful trails, women and children tending fires, preparing food, washing clothes. All paused to watch the riders enter. Their eyes fell on Elias with a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and something darker. He wasn't the first white man to cross into their world, but he might be the first who wasn't dragged. Red Eagle led him toward the central fire ring, where 7 men sat waiting in a semicircle. Elders, their faces carved by time and weather. Each wore a different pattern of beads, feathers, and animal hides. They looked at Elias not with anger, but with a piercing silence that weighed heavier than any scream. The warriors dismounted, and Elias was motioned to do the same. He slid off his horse and landed lightly, keeping his movements slow, respectful. The circle opened slightly, allowing Little Dove to pass through and sit behind her father. Scout lay down at Elias's feet, growling low when anyone got too close. One of the elders spoke in Comanche. The language rolled and clicked like wind through canyon stone, foreign, musical, dangerous. Red Eagle responded in the same tongue, voice measured, strong. He gestured toward Elias, then to Little Dove, then held up the torn piece of cloth Elias had given him. The explanation continued for several minutes. The elders listened without interruption, nodding occasionally. Then another voice cut through the quiet, sharper, accusatory. Fire. Crow. The warrior stepped forward from the crowd, eyes fixed on Elias with thinly veiled hatred. His face bore a scar across the jaw, and his hands gripped a ceremonial lance. He spoke rapidly, voice rising. Elias didn't understand the words, but he didn't need to. The intent was clear. This man wanted blood. One of the elders motioned for silence. Fire Crow took a step back but didn't sit. His glare remained locked. Then Red Eagle turned to Elias. He says you are clever, that you speak honeyed words to hide snake intentions, that you let the child live only to bargain for your own safety. Elias didn't answer right away. He bent down, scratched behind Scout's ear, then stood again. Let me ask you something, he said, voice quiet but steady. If I wanted to ransom her, don't you think I'd have sent a rider to town, or tied her up? Or kept a weapon pointed at her head? He stepped closer to the fire. I gave her food, my last bowl of stew. I gave her my chair, my blanket, not because I thought she was important, not because she was your daughter, but because she was a little girl who couldn't stand on her own. One of the elders leaned forward, eyebrows narrowing. Elias reached into his coat and pulled out the small tintype photo of his wife and son. He handed it to Red Eagle. My boy was about her age, Elias said. Lost him to sickness 3 years back. Lost his mother too. I ain't looking for pity, but I know what it feels like to look at a child and see your whole world vanish if you turn your back. Red Eagle studied the photo for a long time. Then he passed it to the eldest councilman, a man whose hair was stark white, his face carved by decades of wind and war. Little Dove stood suddenly and began to speak. Her voice was soft at first, but soon filled the space like a drum beat. She told them everything, how she'd gotten lost in the storm, wandered without food or water for days, how she collapsed near Elias's creek. She mimed the moment he lifted her, the way he offered bread, the way he slept by the door instead of the bed. She pointed to the scar on Elias's arm, where he'd accidentally burned himself on the stove trying to prepare a hot meal. Fire Crow interrupted, a sharp bark of protest. The old councilman raised a hand, silencing him. He asked the girl something. She nodded. Red Eagle translated. He asked if she truly believes you would help her again, knowing it might mean your death. Elias looked at her. She didn't hesitate. Yes, she said in broken English. Always. The elders began to speak among themselves, voices low and gravelly. Elias waited, heart pounding. He knew this part, the decision. They were trying to weigh centuries of pain against one man's action, trying to believe mercy didn't make them weak. Finally, the white-haired elder stood. Red Eagle stepped forward. The spirits have tested us tonight, the chief said. Not in battle, but in judgment, and they demand we look beyond fear. He paused. "You will return to your land, Elias Callahan. No harm will come to you. You have earned that right." A wave of relief swept through Elias, so powerful it nearly buckled his knees. But then Red Eagle raised a hand. "There is one condition." Elias stiffened. "If any of our people, young or old, come to you hungry, wounded, or lost, you will show them the same kindness." Elias nodded. "You have my word." The old man smiled, just a flicker. Little Dove stepped forward again and surprised everyone. She walked to Elias, took his hand in hers, and turned to the council. "This man," she said softly, "he gave me life when I had none. Now I give him mine in return." It wasn't a debt, it was a bond. And in that quiet moment, around the fire, in a land where kindness had often been buried beneath blood and ash, something fragile but unshakable began to take root. Elias didn't know what it would mean, but he knew it mattered. The council was adjourned, and tomorrow they would ride together, not as enemies, but as witnesses to a choice that changed everything. The return ride to the ranch began just before dawn, under a pale grey sky that hadn't yet decided whether to shine or storm. Elias rode in silence beside Chief Red Eagle, the others falling in behind them in a quiet procession. Scout kept pace beside the horses, tongue lolling but ears alert. The land around them, so hostile just yesterday, now felt oddly still, like it too was waiting to see how this uneasy peace would hold. Elias had barely spoken since leaving the fire circle. The weight of what had happened, and what nearly had, pressed on him like a wet coat. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt lucky. Lucky the girl had lived, lucky she'd found her voice, lucky the elders had chosen understanding over vengeance. But luck was fragile, and fragile things had a way of breaking when you least expected it. They were still a mile from his property when the first voice rang out, angry, sharp. From the rear flank, Elias turned in his saddle. Fire Crow. The warrior had broken formation, riding fast up the side of the column. His face was tight, jaw clenched, eyes burning with a fire that hadn't dimmed overnight. He barked something in Comanche, short, harsh, a command or a challenge. Red Eagle raised a hand, bringing the procession to a halt. Fire Crow rode forward until he was face to face with the chief. Then he turned to Elias, jabbed a finger in his direction, and spoke again, faster this time, more emotional. Little Dove, riding just behind, made a noise in protest. She urged her mare forward, but Red Eagle raised a hand to stop her. He looked at Elias with a heavy expression. "He says mercy has made us weak, that we dishonor the spirits by letting a white man walk free after taking what was sacred. He says the council was deceived by tears and stories." Elias stayed still, reins loose in his hands. "He wants a test," Red Eagle continued. "A challenge by old law. Not to death, but to dignity. He says you must prove that what you gave my daughter was not fear, but honor." Elias stared at the man who, not 24 hours ago, would have happily opened his throat. "And if I refuse?" he asked. "Then the peace ends here," Red Eagle said simply. "He will ride to the elders and demand they reconsider. He has influence, and you will have no escort home." Little Dove's voice cut through the morning air. She spoke in Comanche, quickly, passionately. Her hands moved as she talked, pointing to Elias, then to Fire Crow, then mimicking the way Elias had carried her, fed her. Fire Crow shouted back, louder, more forceful. Elias caught one word, wasichu, a term he'd heard before, a white man, but said like it meant poison. Scout growled low, sensing the tension. Elias looked to Red Eagle. "What kind of test?" "A walk," the chief said. "Unarmed, through the circle. Each warrior will stand and judge for themselves if you are guilty or worthy. Elias glanced at the line forming, warriors moving from horseback to stand along both sides of the path, eyes narrowed, faces unreadable. "They will not touch you unless one believes your life was taken unfairly from us," Red Eagle said. "But their judgment may be harder than their blades." Elias dismounted slowly. "Seems I don't have much of a choice." Little Dove slipped from her horse and grabbed his sleeve. "You don't have to," she whispered. Elias looked down at her. "Yeah, I do." He handed her the reins, gave Scout a firm stay command, and stepped forward. The circle widened. He walked. Each step echoed like thunder in his chest. He passed the first warrior, young, bare-chested, paint still fresh. The man said nothing, just watched. Elias nodded slightly and kept moving. Second, third, fourth, some eyes held contempt, some uncertainty, one or two, something like reluctant respect. Fire Crow stood near the end, arms crossed, eyes locked on him like twin rifle barrels. Elias kept walking. He didn't flinch when a spear was slammed into the dirt beside him, didn't pause when a voice muttered something behind his back. He just walked, until the circle closed again, until he stood alone in the center. No one had stopped him, not a hand raised, not a blade drawn. Red Eagle stepped forward. "You have walked the path of fire," he said, "and came out unburned." Elias let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Fire Crow didn't speak, but he didn't argue either. That was enough. They remounted, rode in silence again. When the ranch came into view, bathed in the golden light of early morning, Elias felt something shift in his chest. Not relief exactly, something more complex, like finding your home still standing after a tornado. You're grateful, yes, but also aware that next time it might not be. They rode up to the barn. Scout barked once and bounded ahead, tail wagging. The land looked untouched. No flames, no blood. Just quiet. Little Dove dismounted first. She walked to the porch, then turned back. "Come," she said to her father. Red Eagle joined her. Inside, Elias's home was just as he left it. The stew pot on the stove, the chair with the worn cushion, the photo still on the shelf. Little Dove pointed to each one as she spoke. Her father followed her gestures, nodding slowly. He picked up the photo of Elias's wife and son, turned it over, then looked at Elias. "You have lost," he said. Elias nodded. Red Eagle handed him the picture. "That loss made room for this." He stepped back, turned to his daughter and spoke in a low voice. Then to Elias, "Tonight, you are invited to the naming fire. My daughter wishes to give thanks." Elias blinked. "To who?" "To you, and to the spirits who led her to your door." He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. That night, they would gather. And in the flicker of flame and the hush of 100 voices, something new would be born, something more than truce, something more than survival, something beginning. The fire crackled in the center of the open circle, casting long, flickering shadows on the faces of the Comanche men, women, and children who sat around it in complete silence. The wind had calmed, and the sky above was studded with stars, clear and cold. Every detail, the rustle of robes, the low creak of saddle leather as someone shifted their seat, even the distant hoot of an owl, felt magnified in the stillness. Elias sat near the fire between Chief Red Eagle and Little Dove, the warmth of the flames licking at his boots. He wore his best, though worn, button shirt, tucked neatly, hands resting on his knees, trying to look composed. Scout sat behind him, calm now, tail curled neatly around his paws, like he understood the sacredness of the moment. They hadn't spoken much since arriving. Elias had eaten the meal offered to him, a stew of venison and roots, and listened to the soft murmur of conversations in Comanche, catching only glimmers of meaning. Some of the warriors who had once glared at him now gave short nods. Others still watched with caution. Across the fire, the council elders reassembled, seated with solemn dignity, the flickering light throwing deep lines across their weathered faces. Then Red Eagle stood. He raised both hands, and the entire gathering fell into complete silence. "My daughter was lost," he said, his voice deep and calm. "Taken by storm, by hunger, by the cruelty of the wilderness. We believed she would return to the sky, to the spirits who gave her life." He turned, looking down at Little Dove. "But she did not. She lived, because a man who owed us nothing saw her pain and answered with mercy." Red Eagle turned now to Elias, meeting his gaze. "This land has taught us many things, how to fight, how to endure, how to remember, but it rarely teaches us how to forgive, and rarer still, how to trust." He stepped forward and removed something from beneath his robe. A thin strip of tanned leather with a pendant carved from bone and wrapped in copper wire, shaped like a rising sun. "This is the mark of a bridge walker," Red Eagle said. "One who walks between two worlds and brings no fire, only peace." He held it out. Elias didn't move for a long second. Then, slowly, he reached up and took the pendant, the leather warm from the chief's hands. "You will wear this," Red Eagle said. "And no Comanche warrior shall raise steel or fire against you so long as you carry it with honor." Elias nodded. His throat was tight, words trapped somewhere between disbelief and humility. Then Little Dove stepped forward. She held something small in her hand, a single white feather tied at the base with blue thread. "In my naming," she said in English, voice soft but clear, "I give thanks." She turned to the fire, then to Elias. "From now, I am called She Who Bridges Wind, because I crossed death on wind and storm, and found life again in kindness." A low murmur of approval rippled through the gathering. A name meant everything here. It marked change, purpose, direction. Little Dove turned back to Elias, then looked to Red Eagle, who gave a single nod. She stepped closer and took Elias's hand, placing the feather in his palm. "You gave me a name too," she said. Elias blinked. "What's that?" She smiled gently. "Grey Hawk." Laughter stirred gently through the circle. Warm, genuine, not mocking. Elias gave a small chuckle. "Don't know that I deserve that." Red Eagle replied, "We don't name men for what they were. We name them for what they become." The fire roared a little higher as more logs were added. Drums began softly, a low, rhythmic thump that pulsed through the ground like a heartbeat. People began to hum, chant, clap. A celebration, but not wild, measured, respectful, a welcome. Elias watched it all with a quiet awe. For the first time in years, he wasn't a man standing outside something. He was part of it, not entirely, not forever, but enough. Later that night, when most had drifted into their tents or sat around smaller fires, Elias remained near the central flame. Little Dove curled against her father, fast asleep, the bone pendant around Elias's neck glinting in the firelight. Red Eagle sat beside him, staring into the flames. "She is strong," he said. "She is something else," Elias replied. "You remind me of someone," the chief said after a pause. "Who's that?" "My brother. He died in a raid years ago. Chose to protect a settler family when others chose to burn." Elias looked at him. "And you forgave him for that?" "No," Red Eagle said. "I didn't understand him. Not then. I thought he'd been fooled. But now, maybe he just saw farther than I did." They fell into silence again. "You ever think this could last?" Elias asked. "Peace, I mean." Red Eagle looked at the stars. "Peace is not a fire," he said. "It doesn't roar. It doesn't warm you all at once. It's a seed, and it grows slow." Elias nodded. "Then I'll keep watering it." The chief gave a small smile. "You do that, Grey Hawk." Years later, Elias Callahan never left the land. He stayed in that little ranch outside Amarillo, built another fence, a new well, and a second chair for visitors who began to pass through, not just settlers, but Comanche, Apache, Mexican riders, drifters from the old world. His cabin became something between a home and a meeting place. Each spring, without fail, she who bridges wind returned, now tall and proud, carrying baskets of food and stories from her travels. She became a translator, a peacekeeper, and when tensions flared again between the people of the land and the newcomers, she stepped in, not with weapons, but with memory. She told them the story of a hungry child, and a man who didn't ask who she was before saving her life. Elias lived to see 73. He died with Scout curled beside his bed, and a crowd of people, Comanche and white alike, gathered outside to say goodbye. They buried him beneath the lone cottonwood beside the creek where it had all started. And on his grave they placed the feather she'd given him, not because he'd earned it in blood, but because he'd earned it with mercy.